Thank you, Jenny. It's
Wait a
great
second.
to be
Oops.
here. There we go. So, thank you all for joining us in this webinar on this rather chilly January day. As you can see from the bios that didn't get read, Bora and I have been doing environmental education for a long time. And Bora, this isn't on presenter mode yet.
It's not. Okay, that's what I was worried about.
We're both going to be sharing back and forth in this presentation. So this isn't a typical one where one person talks and then you figure out your questions and then the next person talks. We're just going to be going back and forth. And what I'd love for you to do as we get started is to use the chat to tell us what state you're coming from and what your program area is. I used to work in extension, and so I know that there's a huge range of programs out there from livestock and agriculture to, oh, I don't know, energy and community development. But let's see who all is represented out there, and that may tell us how to work some examples. Great. Well, we've got some 4-H folks and financial education. Oh, good. Some health. That's great. Keep on doing that, and I will keep talking. So, as we mentioned, the title of this is Civic Engagement for Climate Action. And what we're really talking about is this document, there we go, that is part of the Guidelines for Excellence series. Bora is going to give you some background on that series so you know what it is, and she will take it away from here.
Okay, thank you. So as Martha mentioned, we just want to spend a little bit of time telling you about the NEE Guidelines for Excellence program that this publication is part of before we jump into a more detailed discussion of what you will find when you go in and explore the guidelines. I should mention, this is important, that the Guidelines for Excellence is an initiative of the North American Association for Environmental Education, or NAAEE. And I encourage you to investigate NAAEE. It's a great, great organization. We've had amazing luck to be part of the EE360 Plus partnership, um, and also to receive funding from the US EPA Office of Environmental Education for this project pretty much throughout its whole history. But we've also had amazing other partners over the years who help us to develop these guidelines and to help us disseminate them widely to folks out there. So in the series, there are 7 publications. And just to give you a little bit of a thumbnail for each one of them, the first one is basically K-12 learner expectations that lead to environmental literacy. They're equivalent to our national standards like NGSS or the C3 social studies standards or the Common Core, that kind of thing. And they're benchmarked at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. So they help map out how you might help learners get towards environmental literacy. And environmental literacy is core for environmental education. We've also developed a set of guidelines that's really all about what makes good quality instructional materials. So all of those activity guides out there that we give to educators of various ilks to help them do activities, lessons with their learners. So this set of guidelines helps people think about what are good quality instructional materials for the developer to use, but also for the user to sort of be able to say, well, should I adopt these materials or not? We also have a set of guidelines that's really environmental educator competencies. So what is it that we need to know and be able to do to be good environmental educators? There's guidelines to help with program development process, from needs assessment to program design and implementation to evaluation, guidelines for early childhood environmental education, and a set of guidelines that looks at how do we go from taking our programs to the community, and how do we actually work collaboratively with communities? And then finally, our newest set of guidelines, which are the ones that focus on climate action and justice. And we'll get into those more deeply in just a minute or two. But I want to give you a bit of background about how these guidelines are developed, because it's kind of important to what we do and why we do it. All of the guidelines are rooted in research and practice. The very first activity, once we've identified a general topic, is we search the literature, we look at practice to try to identify sort of what the big issues are. We form a writing team, and once that writing team has a draft ready to share, we use a broad-based critique and consensus process, where we've literally involved thousands and thousands of individuals and organizations to shape this suite of sets of guidelines. As important, however, to development of these sets of guidelines is that we believe that by involving professionals, we're encouraging real discussions about the theory and practice of environmental education. These discussions often have gone way beyond the topic of the set of guidelines, but the educators had a chance to reflect on what it means to be an environmental educator and what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish. And finally, we kind of believe that this set of guidelines, or having guidelines in general, that are based on this critique and consensus, collective wisdom of the field, that we're collecting and documenting effective practices. And this is the first step in building a strong professional identity and a strong profession of environmental education. So I'm going to hand that over to Martha.
And all that brings us to our latest guideline, which is this one, Educating for Climate Action and Justice. We started this whole development process, just like Bora said, by doing the research and interviewing about 20 folks across the field from a variety of organizations and backgrounds. We wanted to know what they thought about this topic, and I think initially the topic was climate change, and what makes it effective. We also asked them for their recommendations of what could be included in the guidelines and who else we should contact, particularly thinking about that writing team. So that work led to the development of a really fantastic writing team made up of 12 folks. They all brought different expertise in climate justice, climate education, climate change, youth engagement, a variety of things. They met several times online and several times in person over the course of about 2 years to develop the guidelines, respond to the comments that came in, and just keep thinking and mulling and working out what these things should be. We also formed an advisory group that provided additional insight and helped steer us into a direction that would be useful. Throughout the whole process, we involved at least 800 individuals and organizations in providing information, reviewing drafts, giving a feedback, and loads of comments. Not all of which were opposite, but some of them were. So our product, after all this, is a set of guidelines. And these are really suggestions for program development. So I thought we'd start in the beginning by asking you to go back to that chat and think about what it is that you try to remember when you start to design and then implement a climate program. Now, some of what we do as extension educators is the same for any kind of program. So some of that generic stuff is relevant to climate too. But is there anything specific that might be unique to climate that you would keep in your mind as you try to develop a climate program? And I'll wait a minute for you to do some typing. Great. Thanks, Raz. right out of the box with icebreakers because you got to get people engaged. Hope is essential, and that draws attention to emotions in the affective domain, which might be important to think about with climate. David suggests we think about who is the audience and what do they care about, because it's got to be relevant. And that relates to what Jenny says about community members and their experiences. Interpretation principles are helpful, not just education, and hands-on engagement. Some of that might be age specific, but how we engage people is certainly always relevant. Meeting them where they're at. Yes, all this is important. And what I think is that you all know an awful lot. I mean, you're climate educators. You're doing this work. And so we don't want to say, oh, we know more than you do, because you know exactly what we know. And in some ways, the guidelines are going to duplicate and reinforce what you already know. But I'm hoping that there could be a few things in the guidelines that you're not currently doing that might provide you some ideas about how you might extend what you're doing and maybe think about something new and different. So these are ways that might enhance what you're already doing. The good thing about the way NAAEE puts together these documents is that they also include references that you can use to justify your programs, examples and case studies of other things that are out there. So if you need to convince somebody to work with you, you can say, oh, here's where they've already done this. We can do it too. So the guidelines have a lot of resources that you can use even though you're already doing climate education. So Bora is going to tell us more about what's in this document.
Okay, thank you very much. So from the very beginning of our effort to develop this set of guidelines, we had a really big, broad guiding notion. We wanted to provide recommendations and resources that support using education as a tool for addressing climate change. So that was our starting point, big, broad. We also went really broad when we thought about who the educators might be that we were hopefully going to speak to with this set of guidelines. So we thought of in terms of teachers, extension agents, museum staff, librarians, weather broadcaster, faith educators, youth educators, all sorts of different people within formal and non-formal and informal education programs, working with everything from the very youngest all the way through adults. We have somebody on our writing team who's an early childhood educator. So even though a lot of climate education doesn't really apply to that 3-year-old, we were still always mindful of like, well, how might we start the process within that early childhood age? We also began the process as a writing team focusing on sort of what we saw as 4 foundational pillars that would guide all of our work. So the first was, frankly, a recognition that there is a climate crisis. I don't think that probably surprises many of you. And that Earth systems and human systems are intertwined. So that was just that we put it out there. We said that's where we're starting from. But we also know the importance of addressing solutions. Otherwise, people become hopeless and depressed and anxious. And we know that there are things communities and industries and individuals are currently doing, and that there's much more that people can be doing. From the very beginning, we decided that given the urgency of climate change, these guidelines needed to focus on not just on climate change or reflect current climate science. Both of those things are incredibly important, but that we also wanted to focus on these climate solutions. We wanted to explicitly avoid a message that was heavy on gloom and doom and make sure that people sort of had that hope within them, that notion that there were solutions. The third pillar really focuses on climate action, and it's again quite purposeful. The guidelines could focus again on education about climate science and how to do that really, really well. Incredibly important. How to engage people in learning about climate change. Again, incredibly important. But the team, following the research literature, decided that we wanted to be more specific and we wanted the guidelines to focus on educational efforts that foster climate action. This includes identifying a process to learn about and select an action and building the skills that will be necessary to take that action. And finally, our fourth pillar is that we knew that any effective climate change education effort needed to address climate justice, um, just as much as it needed to address any of the other pillars. In the guidelines introduction, we make the argument that effective climate education requires an understanding and a centering on climate justice, as well as a willingness to work towards solutions that address the impact of climate change. In order to get to climate justice, you need climate action, though. And that action needs to be developed through a process and lead to an outcome that promotes climate justice. So we saw all of these four pillars really interacting, intertwining with one another, and supporting one another. So based on those pillars and that sort of thinking through what was important and why were we doing this work and what type of set of guidelines did we actually want to develop, we created what we call key characteristics. So we created 5 key characteristics that basically outline a framework for effective education for climate action and justice. There are many different ways that we could have diced and sliced those 4 pillars. You can always have many more key characteristics or fewer key characteristics. The cross-cutting of them is always, a question. But we decided that over the 2 years and hearing the feedback from people of what seemed to make sense and resonate with folks out in the field, we ended up with these 5 big key characteristics. One of the things that you will notice right off is that there is not a justice key characteristic. In an early draft, our first draft, climate justice was a key characteristic, but it seemed artificial to the writing team. It seemed as if it was pulling it kind of off to the side when we really felt that it was something that needed to be infused throughout. And so we got into that awkward bit of having it pulled off to the side but bringing it up in other places. And the feedback that we got from people is that they saw it as being awkward also and artificial. So in the end, climate justice is infused throughout the guidelines and highlighted in each and every key characteristic. So each and every phase or step that we outline in the guidelines. So our first key characteristic, we started with one that suggests how educators should approach climate education by creating a collaborative, welcoming, and responsive learning environment. Basically, we think that with all of environmental education, whether you're taking kids out for a one-day walk in the woods or you're doing an ongoing community-based program down at the library or working with 5th graders throughout the year, and it's important to ensure inclusive learning environments, engaging learners in open inquiry, and working with learners to explore worldviews and perspectives. We also felt that it was particularly important, probably because it's climate and because it's controversial, that the learners and the educators examine climate change information and misinformation. And one of the things that we wanted to sort of say, which may be kind of duh, is that this first key characteristic describes effective education, whether you're focusing on climate or biodiversity or solid waste. But we felt that it was important to articulate it and lay it out with sort of a focus on climate education. So the second key characteristic focuses on knowledge and skills that foster climate action and justice. So again, we're taking that lens of that everything is about fostering climate action and fostering climate justice. But what are the basic knowledge and those skills that we'll need in order to do that kind of work? This key characteristic puts an emphasis on understanding Earth systems and human systems and developing systems thinking skills. It also focuses on the development of the action strategies and skills and the building of personal and civic responsibility that you need in order to foster climate action and justice. As we were developing our guidelines, we knew that the federal agencies were revising their climate literacy guide. So we kind of didn't bother to go into the types of depth that they talk about because they did it. It was also kind of handy dandy because Frank Niepold, who was one of the leaders of that process of developing the climate literacy essential principles for understanding and addressing climate change. He was on our writing team. So we were able to sort of give some feedback back and forth and recognize that we were really sort of pretty much on the same page as we moved along. We basically think that every climate education model or set of guidelines typically includes some sort of foundation of climate science knowledge and may get into a bit of the skills. We're recommending that if you haven't already looked at them, because they're pretty new, they were launched in the fall, is that you take a look at the climate literacy essential principles. It's really a great companion piece to our guidelines. And as Martha sort of mentioned, they're a resource that can give you some background. They could give you an entree into certain groups of people to basically say, not only do I think that this sort of work is important, but here's work that has been done by all of these federal agencies. So the intersection between our guidelines and the essential principles are, sort of pretty obvious once you start to play with them, is that in addition to placing an emphasis on the science behind climate change and that knowledge that you need, which is their essential principle number 2, they talk about the impacts, which is principle number 4. They talk about mitigation, principle number 7. They also call out equity, which is principle number 5. And they say basically that climate justice is possible if climate actions are equitable. And they call out hope and urgency, which is number 8. A livable and sustainable future for all is possible with rapid, just, and transformational, okay, that word, climate action. So we really see this as being a great complementary piece to our guide, and we certainly hope that they see our set of guidelines as complementary for them. Key characteristic 3 calls attention to the importance of climate emotions. We obviously don't want learners to increase their level of worry or their concerns or their anxiousness or their grief. We want them to recognize that people are doing things and that things are possible. we as educators need to recognize and acknowledge that climate emotions are real, that we have them, that our learners have them, and that they really need to be addressed one way or the other in our programs. We also call out the need for to cultivate constructive hope and to develop self-efficacy and agency. With constructive hope, it's a concept that is based on research evidence. And basically what it tells us is that hope needs to go beyond wishful thinking. That's wishful thinking is great, you know. I certainly hope it doesn't rain tomorrow because I really want to go for that hike out on the coast. Um, yeah, wishful thinking, we do it all the time. But in order for things to hope really matter, we need learners to develop constructive hope, where they actively engage with shaping the future with a plan to achieve a goal, where they're actively engaged in taking action. So that notion of constructive hope is really key to this idea of that we need to have attention on climate emotions. I'll turn it over to Martha.
Thank you. So Bora has just gone through the first three key characteristics. I'm going to do the last two, number 4 and number 5, with some examples. And so that's just where we are in the roadmap. So here we are at number 4. Excellent climate change education is locally focused and community driven. Now, by community, we could mean either a geographic community, like a town or a city or a neighborhood, or a functional community, like a school or a workplace. Either one works as a community. And we want good education to be relevant to that community, those community members, which means the educator is going to be making a bridge between the learner and the communities. And having that community engaged could also mean that the educator now has more expertise available to them, filling in some gaps perhaps in climate science or climate justice or climate action, whatever they need, and more people are engaged. It also means that if the learners are going to be doing a community project as their action, there's a local place for it. And it's just easier to see success when you're working locally than when you're trying to work at the national or international level. So we're talking about developing skills that move in this direction. There's a number of useful tools that might help you as educators think about the community. And one is EJ Screen. Jenny already put the website in the chat. So there it is, and it's on the screen again. The Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool is developed by the US EPA. And in case you're not familiar with it yet, we'll just give you an introduction right here. One thing I might want to say, however, is go there soon. We don't know how much longer this website will be active. We just don't know these things. So there's categories on the left that you'll see when you get to the EJ screen, and you can plug in the zip code or the community name of where the community is you're looking for. So you do that, you get these categories on the left, and they're all different kinds of maps. So the Environmental Justice Index, so right there in the center is the list of the justice indexes. Those are actually a combination of both the environmental burden index and the demographic index. So they're already mushed together, showing you the percentage of people by census blocks that are exposed to each of these burdens, whichever one you've clicked on. There are maps for climate data, and you can see in the upper right corner there, it's flood, wildfire, floodplain, sea level rise, and extreme heat. But there is not an overlay between the climate data and the demographic data. So you have to do that by eyeball. So here's an example of flood risk in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. because you got to pick somewhere. And of course, Pittsburgh has rivers running through it, and next to the rivers, it's where there's a flood risk. But you can also see that it's sort of spotty as you go beyond that. And if you take the demographic data from the housing burden, which happens to be where people earn less than median income and spend more than 30% of it on housing, that's the census blocks of where that's showing up. So you can see there's some overlap between housing burden and flood risk. So if you're looking to do a workshop, for example, on climate issues, and you want to pick one of those places, you might want to emphasize flooding as an impact of climate, because that could be relevant to them. So you can also look at other kinds of maps and align those to climate change. You can grab any of the socioeconomic indicators, which could suggest justice issues of some sort, people of color, unemployment, limited English, etc. This one happens to show low income along with flood risk. So you can see who you're talking to. Or if you're talking to a community from, somewhere on the hills outside Pittsburgh, and they're interested in doing an activity around justice, then they need to go to this website and figure out, okay, here's a community that we could think about doing something with, and then organize how you communicate with that community and everything else. So that's the EJ screen. The fifth characteristic is civic engagement for climate action. It sounds kind of similar to what we were just talking about. And we went around mushing these together and pulling them apart several times and decided that, no, first, people need to learn about the community. And second, people need to think about action. And there's many different kinds of actions, of course. You can plant trees, you can clean up streams, you can do all sorts of things. But we're saying, what is excellence in environmental education and climate education? And excellence, we thought, we're recommending, is moving towards civic engagement as the kind of action. So it's not just doing something, but it's learning about policy and power and who makes decisions and who influences those decision makers and what are the systems in my community for making a change. And then that becomes the action, working toward making a change. Sometimes it just may be asking for a change. Sometimes it may be telling the newspaper, we're going to make a statement, and getting the newspaper to help encouraging people to make a change. There's all sorts of ways you can make change. And so we're suggesting, think about civic engagement. It's empowering. And people can see that they could be making a change in policy for the long term, not just for the length of time this particular maintenance person is willing to keep this particular garden in its location, but for the long time. So that's important. So yeah, I'm just checking to see that I've said everything I wanted to say. It's a process, and that's what we wanted to say. I think there are several extension programs around the country that are using the exact same series and process of learning information, making a difference in your community. And those are all the climate stewards programs that there's probably people from Cornell and California and Oregon and Illinois on this webinar. And so, yes, you've got programs, and there's probably more. In the common denominator seems to be that participants get information about climate and climate impacts, apply them to their local area, work together to figure out what they can do to either increase community resilience or reduce greenhouse gases. And this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the middle there are the objectives from the Cornell program. And what I've done is to add the arrows on the bottom that suggest the key characteristics in the NEAE guidelines that relate to those 4 objectives. For example, Bora said that guideline number 1 has to do with the welcoming atmosphere and engaging people and doing a good job of running a program. That's number 1. So I've got number 1 spread out through 1, 2, and 3 of the objectives. because whenever the educator is leading the group, that's how they're going to do it. Knowledge and skills in characteristic 2 seem like they're really presented in objective 2 because you're developing the confidence and skill. The success stories and examples that build hope, which is our characteristic 3, seem to be embedded in objective number 2. And as they create their own activity, it comes up in objective number 4. And then the local community is engaged in number 3 and number 4. So that's our characteristic 4. And finally, the action is the activity that they do in objective 4, and that's characteristic 5. So there's a close correlation. These guidelines are nothing dramatically new. We're just thinking that it's a resource that's out there that might be useful to you. Another example is that we believe youth also can follow these guidelines and do climate action and justice. The CAPE program is Community Action Projects for the Environment, developed out of the University of Florida. It was developed for 4-H, but we've had groups in museums and zoos and schools use it as well. In fact, this summer we're going to pilot this CAPE program with senior citizens to see how that works. And it's basically a process where the group goes through brainstorming and exploring, developing and implementing an action project, and then reflecting on it. The action in this case is that they identify a decision maker and make a request for a change that benefits everybody related to whatever issue it is that they've chosen to explore. And Jenny's going to put up another URL for CAPE. And that's the end of our orientation to the program itself. Bora?
Okay. So just to let you know that these materials are available for free download from the NECI website. So you can click on the URL, or I put the URL in the chat. And that you can also get to all of the sets of guidelines that I mentioned. They're all available for free download up on the NECI website. And then finally, we just wanted to point out that NECI has developed a climate change education hub that you can find information about education policy and research about effective climate change education strategies, climate justice resources, and much, much more. So please, visit that NECI, go to the climate change stuff, and you'll be in to do all sorts of great and wonderful things. So with that, we're going to stop sharing and open it up for questions.
You can, of course, type your question in the chat, but Jenny,
Yeah.
can they also talk?
I don't think folks can talk. I'm sorry.
All right.
Okay. Well, then you'll have to type.
Yeah, type away, type away. And I just, while you're thinking about your questions or comments, I put in Martha's email and my email into the chat. And so if you think of something, tomorrow when you're bicycling to work or skiing to work, depending on where you live, please feel free to email us.
Would you be, so you showed the website, the NAAEE website. Do you want to spend some time helping us navigate that website? Would you feel comfortable, or instructing me on how to navigate it so I can
Oh, well, that's a good question.
wonder?
Okay. Well, while you talk, let me see if I can find it easily while we're sitting here. And
Well, while Bora's
or
doing that,
Martha,
I will
yeah.
just mention that NAAEE does workshops around these guidelines and has a trainers bureau that is full of people who are capable and interested and available to do those workshops in local areas.
Yes.
Extension educators may be interested in becoming a trainer for the climate guidelines or for any other guidelines. And if you are, you need to talk to Bora because she runs that program.
Yeah.
But each of these guidelines now has a series of activities for presenters to use in workshops. So those are resources that are available too.
Yeah, to just feed off of that. We try to help people out as much as we can, and we're very willing to share what we develop. So this PowerPoint, if you want to ask, and we'll make sure you get it. We're great trusting that people will do the right things with stuff. But we do have just sort of scripts or little short, PowerPoints if you're doing that sort of dog and pony show kind of thing, up to an all-day workshop that focuses just on this set of guidelines, or all-day workshops that focus on any of the others. And we have those materials all set up. So this is the NECI website. And there's just a ton of stuff on here. If you have a boring, rainy, snowy day someday, go in and investigate. It's almost all, well, in fact, it is. It's almost all free. It's almost all accessible without, being a member. You sometimes have to sign up for like the EE Pro stuff and have a password, but you don't have to pay anything. And then you have access to everything. So under programs, I should do that. I should say under programs, this is how you could also get to the guidelines for excellence. So we're under programs, whoopsie, we're under the climate change education. And, so there's been a lot of work being done on climate policy. There's a call that is done, I think, monthly, of people looking at advocacy issues around climate education and environmental education in general. So there's just all sorts of, there's this coalition that puts things together. You can join it again for free. NECI is really great in terms of really trying to make things accessible to everybody. So it advertises different, surveys that have been done with educators. So they've done this series of surveys of administrators and classroom teachers. And I believe the newest one is with non-formal educators. So there's just a ton of stuff on here. Different resources, including policy, information about policy, just basic stuff. What is it? Climate literacy, getting into what's happening out there, linking to webinars that are being done. I'm doing another webinar tomorrow that is a shortened version talking about this set of guidelines, but also with Frank Niepold talking about the climate literacy principles, and someone from MIT talking about some service learning resources that they have. So there's just, a lot of stuff out there and available to folks. It just takes some time, to dig into it all.
That's great, Bora. I just wanted to mention that the name North American Association for Environmental Education implies that it's perhaps equally Mexico, Canada, US, but it isn't, unfortunately. We welcome Mexicans, Canadians, and US people to join, but it is primarily driven by the United States membership and resources. Yeah, that's just the way it goes. We have had conferences in Canada and Mexico, and the cost of translating to French and Spanish is really, really challenging for small professional associations to manage. So there's a question about how NAAE is supported and funded, and the demographics. Oh, well, I just started to do that, didn't I? Membership organization, it's members can join and pay a small fee. The conference usually generates small income to help support staff. There are staff. I used to say in Washington, D.C., but they actually work from home in a variety of places. So it's not just Washington, D.C. anymore. And they get grants. big grants, lots of grants, supports from NOAA for climate education, support from US EPA for training, and that's part of the support that has generated the guidelines for excellence. Just lots of partnerships and lots of support. Bora, do you want to say anything more about support and funding and demographics while I think about Paul's question?
Yeah, other than, one of the challenges that NAA has is that, like many small not-for-profits, is that a lot of our funding comes from the federal government. And so that's always precarious. And we're right now in a precarious point. We're supposed to start our 5th year of that EE 360 plus grant that we have with EPA. We're supposed to start that June 1st. Well, the papers haven't been signed. And they normally aren't signed by this time, but we don't know what the new administration will do with EPA in general. And so we're at a, we'll see. So funding is a real issue, but we do get funding from private foundations. We get funding from donors. We get funding from basically whoever will give us money to do the work we do. And so a lot of the attention, I mean, Martha's spending a lot of her time now writing or helping the staff and the executive director write proposals so that we can keep doing the work that we do, but getting the funding to be able to do it. So all of you who write proposals, you know that it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. In terms of the demographics of the membership, most are what I would put into the big bucket of non-formal educators. A lot of agency people, state agency people, natural resources kinds of folks. The people who sponsor things like Project Learning Tree and Project Wet and Project Wild at the state level, university people. So, but again, most of our members are US. We do have a program that we're the secretariat of that's called GEEP, which is the Global Environmental Education Partnership. And that brings in a lot of members from other parts of the world. So we're a weird mix. And now you can think about the next question.
Yes, thank you. Good old Paul. Of course, we all have challenges. Extension is driven by state politics as much as it is driven by national politics. And extension agents are sensitive to politics, both at the state level and their community level. So I think the letter grades range from not doing very much at all in a livestock and range community where people think one thing, and to very high in urban communities where they're on a coast and the sea level's rising and they're talking about making adaptations to climate change. In Florida, I think the Sea Grant folks are doing a phenomenal job of climate literacy in their coastal communities because the communities want to know what's going on and how they can protect themselves and how can they be more resilient. Until we get to that point where everybody in a community wants to know, extension agents are going to have a harder time. We're currently investigating how it is we talk about climate change when people don't want to hear those two words close together. And so I think we need to do some research on motivated reasoning and what are those hot buttons that we want to avoid getting people upset about. And I think these questions are good for everybody, Paul. Should educators do their work without any kind of politics or not? How do we make sure we're doing a good job when education is political? I'm not the one to answer these. I think everybody should think about them. So how are we working through DEI stuff these days?
It's a good question. My personal sense is that people will pick these set of guidelines up, and just as Martha was saying, the people in Florida respond to the people that they're working with. You don't necessarily, if you're doing some sort of workshop, or you're doing some sort of work, or you're developing curriculum materials or whatever, offering a program, typically you're not going to give them this set of guidelines unless you're training them in these guidelines. So it becomes part of the work. Part of the work becomes knowing your group, and knowing the language they use, and knowing what are, things that are they're going to see as being political, or whatever. We were told while we were developing these that in certain communities it's like, nope, we're not going to be able to use them, and it's like, yeah, okay. But can you talk about resilience? Can you talk about community resilience? Can you talk about, well, we know that the sea level is rising in certain places and there's flooding. Can we talk about that, and what to do about it? So I think it becomes a bigger challenge with the current administration, but I stand by our work and I stand by our language. I just think that as with most education, you have to know your audience. And there was a question about my use of non-formal educators. This is an EE thing. Goes back to like the 60s. But basically, we think of non-formal, we put basically a flip between formal educators are K-12 educators, maybe university. And non-formal educators are zoo and museum and nature centers and all of those things. I would put extension agents as non-formal educators in our sort of division of the world. Um, non-formal educators and what the science community calls informal educators are really very much the same thing. So don't get hung up on it.
So I tried to answer Roz's question about DEI. And this is just a hypothesis. I'm putting this out there for you all to think about. In my head, it makes sense to think about climate justice work in 3 different categories. One is, who are the learners? And if I'm specifically targeting a Title I school, then my audience is coming from a certain clientele that counts as justice. No matter who the audience is, the second bucket is the content. I can teach about how climate change is variable and the impacts are variable. And some people get a bigger burden than others. And they already have a bigger burden in some ways socioeconomically than others. And so there's justice and injustice going on. That's the second bucket. The third one relates to that climate action piece and helping people make change. So no matter who it is that's making change, the change shouldn't make injustices more, it shouldn't aggravate the injustice. And so we want the change to work toward creating more justice in any community. And so you can think about doing DEI work in any of those dimensions, I think, and feel like you're helping to move the world in the right direction. And you can call it whatever you need to call it based on your administrator and your state. At least that's what I think.
Okay. I have totally enjoyed this conversation today. Thank you so much, Bora and Martha, for sharing your thoughtful and inspiring, and I'll also say warm approach to thinking about how we can all work together to build equitable futures for all. So I think I just want to give a warm thank you to Bora and Martha for sharing your time today. And then I want to just add that I recently saw a big sign that said, no justice, no peace. And it was spelled K-N-O-W, K-N-O-W. If we know justice, we know peace. And I think it's a very constructive way of thinking about in a certain way, justice is a very profound word, and one that is at the forefront of our whole culture. And within that justice, we can find equity. So I just want to say thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and for folks who want to come to our other webinars for the third Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. Unfortunately, I don't have the registration links because the talks aren't finalized, but in February 19th, we'll be talking about hopefully electrification of farm equipment with new NRCS standards. In March, we'll be talking about environmental justice and solar, both for homeowners and also brownfields. And then in April, hopefully we'll be talking about statewide policies for research and duplication. So you can see what other states are doing or what your state is empowered to do in order to think about how to mobilize behind those current policies. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope to see you next month.
Bye.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.